Hi, my name is Gary Schnell, and I'd like to welcome you into my home near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I am putting together a number of YouTube videos in an effort to highlight different areas of my book, Consciousness All in One and One in All. This particular video will focus on Chapter 2 of my book, and I'm going to call it Heroes and Gods for reasons that will become clear as I talk. I will be focusing on early childhood development, some physical development, psychological development, and neural development, just highlighting certain elements that I think are significant for the kind of ideas that I'm trying to express. My effort is to show how there is an early body of information that is unconscious, but this body of information influences and informs later conscious decisions from its unconscious source. And this unconscious source is somewhat fearfully skewed, and we're going to talk about how that happens. Just a few things about early childhood development. The infant is entirely dependent on a primary caregiver for food and shelter. It lets he or she let their primary caregivers know that something is amiss. Maybe they're hungry, or something hurts, or there's some danger afoot, by crying and getting his or her needs met that way. Soon the child is aware that certain things that he or she does gets needs met, and begins to have an awareness that there is a me and a not me being primary caregiver. With time, that that idea becomes embellished as the child can reach for things, and subsequently can crawl and walk towards things that are of interest, putting things into his or her mouth, for example. And all the while becoming more and more aware that there's a me and a not me. Now, this me and not me development it increases with time as children are able to go off into different rooms. And as they go off into different rooms or different areas where primary caregiver is not available to them, they have what are called transitional objects, which are things that give them the illusion that the primary caregiver is nearby and will take care of their needs should they express a desire for those needs to be taken care of. These transitional objects early on include things like pacifiers and blankets. They later become things like Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. They become rock stars, movie stars, baseball stars. They can become things like interests in politics, political parties, baseball teams, football teams, cars, any number of things that we later wouldn't necessarily call transitional objects, but which are very much closely related to them and serve a purpose of giving us some sense of a proximity, or the illusion of a proximity towards a caregiver. Now, other things are going on with development as well. For example, the child begins to learn that there is a certain willfulness or intentionality that they can exercise, and this is highlighted by the time of toilet training, whereby the child is deciding between his or her desire for gratification, immediate gratification, versus his or her desire to please primary caregivers. Now, I've been using the child and the primary caregiver as terms to this point. I'm going to ask you to consider that there's a transition here that I want to consider toward the idea that the child is a hero and the parents are gods. Now, the idea that parents are gods is obvious because they supply the child's every need early on and are very godlike in nature as a result. The idea of the child as hero is a little less obvious, but will become more obvious with time. Now, the child is faced with this growing distance from primary caregiver, and needs to have some kind of an idea or develop some kind of an idea of how they can maintain that distance. Now, as I said early on, it is in the idea of transitional objects, whereby we carry the illusion that our parents or our caregiver gods will be close to us. But with time, it may seem to the child that there is a great deal of competition for the attention of caregiver gods. There can be brothers or sisters, older or younger, that are to be competed with. There can be parents' interests in other things like cars or sports. From a guy's standpoint, from a girl's standpoint, it might be things like household activities, nesting, kinds of activities, and it can also be sports and cars as well. But these are things that the child may well gravitate to in an effort to, not lose that illusion of favoritism with the god. And so the child does everything he or she can to maintain that illusion, including taking on the interests of parents. Now, parents then are the gods and children are the heroes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I would like to just consider neural development for a little bit, and before I carry on with that further. I have my brain model here. This particular model is a little bit bigger than my brain. This is the left hemisphere. These are the cortices. This is the spinal cord coming up into the pons and the midbrain. Now, the child's brain has roughly the same structure, although it doesn't have all these what are called gyri yet. It's still growing, but there is some semblance of cortices and a frontal cortex. There aren't as many cells there as there will be, and the cells aren't connected like they will be. None of the cells are myelinated to improve the efficiency of those connections like they will be. So the child's brain is continuing to develop with all of those things in mind. Now, what I want to draw your attention to in particular is this little area in here called the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is the way station for every sensation that we experience, with the exception of the sensation of smell. Just outside the thalamus, a little bit deeper in here, is an area called the amygdala, which I can't show you. This model doesn't allow me to, but it would be, this is the right side and this is the back and more toward the front. So the amygdala would be buried in here. And there's another area called the hippocampus, which would be buried in here. They're all very, these groups of cells are all very close to each other in proximity, and they are richly connected to one another. Now, all of the information comes up into the thalamus, and it will develop tracks that lead into the different cortices of our brain, called thalamocortical tracts with time. But it will also be richly connected to the amygdala and the hippocampus. Now, the amygdala is primarily responsible for our fight or flight response, and some include the freeze response with that, fight, flight, freeze. And it's important that this area, of course, the thalamus is developing because it's receiving all of our sensory information, but it's important that the amygdala have some amount of development to it, because it's important for the infant and young child to have a good sense of fear so that he or she can let mom or dad know that they are in need of protection. That is well developed and richly innervated along with the thalamus, and just outside that is the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus we believe to be responsible for many of our memory functions as well as our spatial cognition, and may play a part in modifying emotional responses. But I just want to make it clear that these areas are well developed, or relatively well developed, more so than these areas, so that the our immediate ability to respond to an object is there. Our ability to think things through regarding that response and modify that response just aren't there. Now, as I say early on, this is still developing. So we don't have a sense, we don't have the ability to connect things from a cause and effect standpoint. We are unable to have the kinds of memories that we have later on, because those are based in a cause and effect way. Early on, we just don't have that capacity. So that we have these connections here, and the amygdala is pretty well developed, relatively speaking, and it has connections as well. And the more exercised these connections are, the more we might have a fearful response later, and the less exercised they are, the more likely we are able to modify them later on. Now, the idea that they might be more exercised comes about from the work of Mary Main and Mary Ainsworth, two separate studies done by each of them, referred to a great deal by Dan Siegel in his many books. And the idea is that some children tend to be secure, some children tend to be avoidant, and we have different modalities between the secure and the avoidant, different areas that the child might fall into that are, relatively more secure, less secure. And much of this can depend on the kind of environment the child is being raised in. If the child is raised in a secure environment, a secure and stable environment, that child is more likely to be secure and stable. And so the connections between the thalamus and the amygdala may not be as intense as a child who is raised in an environment that is more chaotic and frightening, in which case they will be, these innervations will be more intense, more exercised, and they will be less subject to change with development. Now, the child is largely borrowing from the parent for organization throughout these early years before it has much of a sense of these connections. Much of the parent's own story can be reflected in the child, so that a child that's secure probably has a parent that was secure, and indeed that's what those studies indicated. And a child that was insecure probably had a parent that was, either avoidant or raised in a chaotic or frightening environment. And so the child tended to reflect that. The child's development is taking on the narrative of the parents, and in fact the child uses the narrative of the parents early on, and that's done again before there is much of this ability to connect ideas from a cause and effect standpoint. So these ideas, though, they can be changed. There's some plasticity to them. For example, if a child is fairly secure and then suffers a loss, we might find out a little bit later that that child is no longer as secure as we once thought, and that was shown by a fellow named Richie Davidson, who did a study that suggested that that was the case. And that there are things that we can do later on that modify the connections between the thalamus and the amygdala and the hippocampus as well. And I won't be talking about those now, but they include things like mindfulness, meditation, secure and happy relationships. Those kinds of things can change some of these connections later on. But for now, we have this developed. It tends to be fearfully oriented, more fearfully oriented if we're brought up in a more chaotic family, and less fearfully oriented, more secure if we're brought up in a more stable family. And again, none of it is conscious. And none of it is conscious yet because we don't have the connections that we need for cause and effect. Now, these connections, they slowly come on. A little bit, 4, 5, a little bit more, 6, 7. And at that point, we can start to have our own narrative apart from mom and dad's. But it's important for our narrative, for us to be the hero, especially if we were raised in a less secure environment, because we need to more forcefully adhere to the idea that of an illusion that we have some proximity to our caregiver, God. So the narrative takes on a story. Because none of the early stuff can be known. So it puts together the story to the best of its ability. It borrows from parents' narratives. But the whole idea of the story is to be the hero, to have that illusion of comfort, safety, security, even when there was very little present in childhood. And so as we develop our own narrative, we have this story that we piece together. There's very little about it that is truthful or real. It's more of a fantasy or an illusion that we develop with time, and the story and the fantasy becomes richer and richer as we tend to think most highly of ourselves and less highly of other people. We can marginalize people. We can diminish them, demean them, all in an effort to puff ourselves up. Bullies do this. This is the nature of things like sibling rivalry. It's the nature of things like jihads and wars. And it's all because there's a lot of fear early on that we're not consciously aware of. And that fear, especially if we're less secure, is more intense, and it influences decisions beyond sibling rivalry. It influences decisions like, friends that we make, schools that we'll attend, people we'll marry, having children, buying houses, everything. It influences, although it influences those things in an unconscious fashion because none of those connections were available. And what is going on is that we have this story, this narrative, this consciousness. So that is my story of heroes and gods, and since I'm the hero of this particular story, that's the story I'm sticking to. Anyway. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this has been informative. I welcome you to ask any questions or make any comments, and please feel free to subscribe. I will get back to any questions or comments you have as quickly as I can. Thank you very much for your time. Be well, be safe in these times.